Welcome, everyone, to What's Next for History in Higher Education. I'm Jim Grossman, Executive Director of the American Historical Association, the largest professional organization of historians in the world. We work on behalf of historians in all fields and in all sorts of workplaces and professions. Operating under a charter from Congress, the AHA promotes history education, the professional work of historians, and the essential role of historical thinking in public life. If you think the conversation that you're about to hear is interesting and even better, useful, I hope you'll consider joining. A membership link will magically appear in the chat. Our speakers today will provide an overview of the legislative and policy landscape for post-secondary history education, nationally and in the States. Our goal is to provide context that might help prepare supporters of honest history, good history, to make the strongest possible case for the value of historical work in higher education institutions, and indeed everywhere in public culture. Everything, after all, has a history. After an overview of key features in recent legislative initiatives affecting history education, our panel of presenters from the AHA and from PEN America will discuss how historians can help to shore up public support for higher education and for evidence-based historical work done at professional standards with professional integrity. Today's event will begin with a brief presentation by Katherine Brausch, program analyst at the AHA and a PhD candidate at the University of Michigan, where she's writing her dissertation on movement lawyers and personal injury law. She received her JD from the University of Michigan Law School in 2018. Now I'm going to hand things over to Kat, and then I will come back and introduce the rest of the panel, and we will continue. So, Kat, it's all yours.
Thank you, Jim, for your introduction. And bear with me as I share my screen. So I'm a historian, but I also use my legal training for the work that I do with the AHA. My job here is to monitor state legislatures for bills that might have an impact on the teaching of history. At this point in the year, it's pretty calm. The bulk of legislation tends to come between January and March. So if you're interested in monitoring your own state legislatures, it's worth checking when the session is, but it's most likely to be late winter through early spring. My role is that I keep an eye on the bills coming out of state legislatures with Google alerts of common keywords, and I check the legislatures' websites for education-related bills being filed. When I find one, I read it, pull apart the language, and think about the implications it might have on history education. If I think it does have those implications, I sign up for bill tracking, and I watch it wend its way through committees, floor votes, and potentially to the State House. It's a pretty simple process, but it gets more complex the more legislation that comes out. And there has been a lot the past few years. So what I'm going to do in the next 10 minutes is look at trends and pull out a few examples of recent legislation. If I went state by state, we'd be here for quite a lot longer than my allotted time. But if you want to follow up on your own state after this webinar, there are databases out there that also do this tracking work. PEN America's is the one that I use most often. So a little bit of background, all of this legislation is downstream from the critical race theory panic of late 2020 and 2021. Nearly all of the initial states, first with explicitly forbidding critical race theory and the 1619 Project. Shortly thereafter, we saw a rhetorical shift where states began to move to instead prohibiting what they called divisive concepts. Divisive concepts legislation, also discussed in terms of anti-discrimination, prohibits the teaching of certain concepts related to race, sex, gender, that sort of thing. I've got some up on the slide here from Florida's HB 7, which passed in 2022. Some of these examples include a person, by virtue of his or her race, color, national origin, or sex, is inherently racist, sexist, or oppressive, whether consciously or unconsciously. A person's moral character or status as either privileged or oppressed is necessarily determined by his or her race, color, national origin, or sex. A quick note is that Florida's law here is one of only a few of the divisive concepts laws that affect both K through 12 and higher ed. Much of the proposed legislation targeted both, but comparatively fewer of these bills were passed for higher education. The legislation affecting higher education sharply increased this year, in large part due to an increasing legislative backlash against DEI. The concepts that these new anti-DEI bills prohibit are largely the same as the older divisive concepts legislation. For the most part, these bills focused on the employment implications, banning training in these concepts, prohibiting diversity statements, closing DEI offices, that sort of thing. But the anti-DEI bills have also been ways for states to pass comparatively unpopular divisive concepts laws aimed at higher education. So, for example, Alabama state legislators had made a couple of unsuccessful passes on their divisive concepts bills, but it wasn't until they repackaged it as an anti-DEI bill in 2024 that it passed. So Alabama Senate Bill 129 prohibits DEI offices, but it also includes a prohibition on public institutions requiring, quote, coursework that advocates for or requires assent to a divisive concept. Prohibiting coursework that advocates for the idea that, quote, any race, color, religion, sex, ethnicity, or national origin is inherently superior or inferior could make assigning primary sources for a political history of the 19th century, for example, to be rather fraught. The consequences here, as with the divisive concepts laws, are generally less about direct penalties for teaching history classes that may violate the prohibitions. Many of them, in fact, contain no enforcement mechanism. But the concern is that they cause a chilling effect on the teaching of certain kinds of history, particularly of race, gender, and sexuality. And we've heard that they do. Just one example, Inside Higher Ed recently reported that in the aftermath of the Texas anti-DEI bill from 2023, Senate Bill 17, North Texas University pulled words like race and equity from course titles, while Texas A&M got rid of its minor in LGBTQ studies. As far as legislation explicitly aimed at universities goes, there are two main avenues. There are curriculum mandates and procedural reforms. Brendan Gillis will talk more about curriculum in a moment, but I wanted to mention one of the proposed bills that we saw this year that I found particularly interesting. Utah legislators attempted to pass a bill creating a School of General Education as an independent academic unit within the University of Utah, which would house the courses for its general education requirements. Its proponents inveighed against what they called cafeteria-style gen ed or liberal arts requirements in universities. This legislation would instead mandate Western civilization courses as general education requirements for all undergraduates. This new academic unit within the university would have its own faculty specifically hired to teach Western Civ Gen Ed requirements. And you can see the intended emphasis in the quote that I've provided from the bill. Quote, only faculty with appointments in the School of General Education may teach Gen Ed courses outside the areas of science, math, econ, or foreign languages. In other words, humanities faculty. As we all know, this conversation is happening within the context of a declining importance of the humanities in comparison to STEM and jobs training. The School of General Education would be a deepening of the rationale for defunding humanities departments, including history, since many more students take history classes as part of Gen Ed's humanities requirements than major in history. The Utah bill didn't pass, but the model legislation is out there, and we're likely to see more of this kind of thing, both in terms of undermining humanities departments and in terms of emphasizing Western civilization and the Western canon, which we have seen in other states for both K through 12 and higher ed. The biggest procedural reform legislation this year has been the attempt to abolish or weaken tenure protections. The attempts at straightforwardly abolishing or limiting tenure all failed. Nebraska's Legislative Bill 1064 would have abolished the academic system of tenure entirely for all of the state's public institutions of higher education. Kentucky's House Bill 228 would have imposed a system of post-tenure review every 4 years, assessing the faculty members' adherence to, quote, performance and productivity requirements. Iowa's House File 2558 required the creation of a system which would authorize the president of the institution to initiate post-tenure review of any employee of the institution at any time. None of these bills became law. Tenure bills couched in culture war language, however, did meet with some success. Indiana's Senate Bill 202, now Public Act 113, focused on expanding intellectual diversity in its institutions of public higher education, bringing such notions into its tenure and post-tenure review procedures. Indiana now requires, in order to receive tenure, an assessment of whether a faculty member is likely to, quote, foster a culture of intellectual diversity and expose students to scholarly works from a variety of political or ideological frameworks, or whether they are instead likely to, quote, subject students to political or ideological views and opinions that are unrelated to the faculty member's academic discipline. This assessment will be repeated every 5 years as a regular post-tenure review process. The law also requires universities to establish a procedure for submission of complaints on whether a faculty member is properly nurturing intellectual diversity in their classrooms. Also, as an aside, this idea of intellectual diversity through legislation is something that we will likely be seeing a lot more of in the coming legislative sessions. The last thing that I want to talk about is declining faculty self-governance and consolidation of power into the hands of presidents and regents. This may not seem like it affects history education, but again, we're speaking within the context of the decline of the importance of the humanities to universities, so I wanted to briefly discuss the effects of this as well. Arizona's House Bill 2735 from earlier this year, which passed the legislature but was vetoed by the governor, would have eliminated the governance powers of Arizona's faculty senates. The faculty of Arizona's state universities have shared governance powers with the university president since 1992. House Bill 2735 would have stripped the power sharing from the law, placing the power over, quote, approving organizational units, defined as departments, institutes, or centers, exclusively in the hands of the university president. Instead of faculty, quote, sharing responsibility and actively participating in governments, they would be relegated to consulting with only. The law's proponents argued that the change was necessary to address the financial crisis at the University of Arizona, but critics of the law pointed to the looming budget shortfall in fear that this consolidation of power into the president would streamline budget cuts, especially, as we've been discussing, to the humanities. In terms of concluding remarks, there's likely to be a lot more proposed legislation along the lines that I've been talking about, starting in January. You can keep yourself informed by monitoring your state's legislative website, keeping an eye on proposed educational bills, and on the bills that get sent to your state's House and Senate higher education committees. And you can follow databases that track this legislation nationally, like PEN America's. Thank you so much for your time and attention today.
Thank you, Kat. And I want to emphasize something that Kat ended with, which is the things that you can do to be involved and to be active. We're historians, and we believe in human agency. And we believe that change happens because of human agency, or sometimes it doesn't happen because of human agency. And Kat made a reference to failed legislation. Failed legislation does not fall based on its own weight. Failed legislation is not a victim of gravity, unless it's a matter of people speaking out against it who speak with great gravity. Failed legislation happens because people and institutions like PEN America and the AHA fight against that legislation. And so I want to emphasize to everybody who is listening to this webinar that you are here in order to find out what you can do, not just what is going on. And I do want to emphasize that when legislation fails, it fails because people work. And we hope that you will participate in that work. Next, we're going to hear from Brendan Gillis about 3 specific trends from the 2023 and 2024 state legislative cycles. He will be joined by Julia Brookins and Jeremy Young for a discussion and audience Q&A. Please use the Q&A function at the bottom of your screen to submit questions to the presenters. I will do a few quick introductions of these people, and then I will disappear. AHA Director of Teaching and Learning, Brendan Gillis, oversees the association's teaching and learning initiatives, which support innovative pedagogy and promote the interest of both educators and students of history. Prior to joining the AHA, Brendan was assistant professor of history at Lamar University in Beaumont, Texas, and has since been promoted to associate professor. Congratulations, Brendan. Jeremy Young is the Freedom to Learn Program Director at PEN America. He leads PEN America's efforts to fight government censorship in educational institutions with a particular focus on higher education. He directs PEN America's work on what PEN labels educational gag orders, their Champions of Higher Education initiative, and an expanding network of coalitions to mobilize support for professors and teachers. Before coming to PEN America, Jeremy served as the communications and marketing manager at the AHA and directed our Freedom to Learn initiative combating legislative censorship in history classrooms. He didn't just direct it, he helped us build it. Julia Brookins is Senior Program Analyst in Teaching and Learning at the AHA. She has been working on our History Gateways initiative to improve student learning and equity in introductory college history courses. She directed our nationwide tuning project and is part of the team that develops initiatives to advance history in education and public life. I especially encourage anyone in this virtual room to watch her recorded testimony before various education-related government entities in Texas, in part because of what I said before, that you can make a difference in your state legislature. And now I'm going to hand this over to Brendan, who will proceed with the rest of the webinar.
Thank you, Jim, and thank you to our guests. Before we delve in, I'm really lucky in that I get to work with a team of really dedicated and knowledgeable colleagues. So Kat is our legislative guru. She tracks state legislation, and she also will give us a first gloss on what we should know about specific bills. Those reports get handed over to me as Director of Teaching and Learning, and Julia and I and others on our staff then step back and think about how these policies might affect history in the classroom. And so that's what I want to talk a little bit about for a few minutes before we step back and have a panel discussion. So we organized today's session around what's next for history in higher education. Now, we are involved in conversations every day about history in higher ed and in other contexts. And I realize this is a complicated issue. To really think about the future of higher ed, we want to talk about declining undergraduate enrollments in history classes. We'd want to think some more about shifting demographics of undergraduate student populations and graduate student populations at colleges and universities across the country. Of course, we might want to pull in decades-long trends involving declining funds available, public funding available for colleges and universities. And there's lots of other factors. Most faculty in the classroom are dealing with the lingering effects of the pandemic and the increasing accessibility of generative AI tools. All of that shapes the future of higher ed, but all of those issues intersect to varying degrees with education policy. And I think we've seen as historians, as an organization, a marked shift in the ed policy landscape as it pertains to higher ed over the last 4 years, since 2020, really. New kinds of bills and efforts to use state government and the instruments of state legislatures to transform the relationship between governments and public institutions of higher education. So Kat already talked about some specific examples. Many of you are probably familiar with the genre of divisive concepts laws that have cropped up in states across the country. Many of them, if you look closely at the language, they have identical or nearly identical descriptions of just what it is that qualifies as a divisive concept. And so here I've pulled out an example from Ohio, a bill in Iowa that intersects with history and history education. This idea that an individual, by virtue of their race or sex, bears responsibility for actions committed in the past by other members of the same race or sex. I think you'd be hard-pressed to find a classroom where someone is trying to teach with that message in mind, but there are organizations that have taken this list of divisive concepts and shared it with legislators across the country. A lot of state legislation is drafted with input from lobbyists and organizations that have an agenda. So here, just very quickly, is a map of educational gag orders as they've been described by Jeremy Young and others at PEN America, in which we see restrictions on what faculty, especially, but also other institutional employees at public schools and universities are allowed to talk about. And you can see most states have witnessed proposals around divisive concepts and other kinds of restrictions on academic freedom. And a significant number of states have actually enacted these restrictions. Underneath the headlines of some of these trends and transformations are some important developments with very specific implications for the work of history educators and history people working in history departments on campuses that may not have grabbed your attention. So Kat, in her presentation, already mentioned the idea of intellectual diversity. And so a number of bills with prompting from outside organizations have adopted intellectual diversity really as an alternative or a replacement for diversity, equity, and inclusion as they are often represented on campus. And I think this really matters because if you look at how these bills define intellectual diversity, it's often at odds with how many historians and many faculty would define the term. So here's an example. As it was introduced, Ohio Senate Bill 83 in 2023 included a definition of intellectual diversity that you can find various places online, where intellectual diversity is defined as multiple, divergent, and opposing perspectives on an extensive range of public policy issues widely discussed and debated in society at large. In this case, they went on to clarify that these are ideas that are poorly represented on campus. We imagine that they likely meant underrepresented here as opposed to represented poorly. But still, the idea that faculty and a culture of intellectual ferment and diversity on campus would be defined purely in relation to public policy raised some questions and concerns among our staff. And you can see the AHA ultimately issued a couple of statements about this bill, advising legislators to, at the very least, make some changes to the way in which it intervened in university administration. And I think as a faculty member myself, someone who has gone through the experience of going up for tenure, the idea that my department could be overruled by another person or body on campus because we may not show enough diversity in our opinions on climate change or any number of politically fraught issues in 2024 is a little bit concerning. So, should faculty be evaluated on the strength of their ideas and their ability to make a strong case for their understanding of human history, or should they be evaluated based on their positions relative to public policy issues? Another example that we've spent a lot of time thinking about is a growing trend among state legislatures to consider curriculum requirements built around specific primary sources. Here is an example that I've seen crop up just many more places than some of the other language, but there are other lists in circulation. And this first presented itself in North Carolina in February of 2023 in what was called the North Carolina REACH Act. And the idea here was to create a history or civics requirement of 1 semester for all public university students in North Carolina, and require that all of those students be assigned to read 6 key primary sources. Now, these are sources that many faculty already teach. But this would be confined to 1 semester. And the law went further to stipulate that the final exam should make up at least 20% of the total course grade and should be focused on these specific texts. Now, this raised concerns as a former faculty member about who should be making decisions about the structure of my course. I know I taught at a university where we divided US history into 2 semesters. And if you really want to cover the founding era up through the civil rights era, like Dr. King's letter from Birmingham jail would force you to do in this class, a lot of universities choose to do this as a 2 semester sequence as opposed to a 1 semester sequence. Importantly, this raised questions about who would actually be teaching the classes, because there was no additional funding provided for departments to cover the consequences of this new curriculum requirement. And what would it mean for the students? This was a new curriculum requirement. Would it disrupt current degree plans? Would it make it harder for students to graduate in 4 years? And would the faculty teaching this mandatory course even be coming from history or related departments? It was unclear. And that issue, I think, ties in with another example, some language that we've seen crop up in a few different contexts. And this has to do with proposed changes to general education. And here's an example from Florida, where a state bill that went into effect in 2023 mandated that general education courses not distort significant historical events, that they not teach systemic racism, sexism, and oppression, and further that they had to include selections from the Western canon. And so this raised a lot of important questions. So who was going to decide what counted as distorting history? Evidently, it was not going to be up to faculty to make this decision. And would courses that try to satisfy general education requirements using non-Western histories, world history, or regional courses from the rest of the world qualify? It seemed to us that the language of this bill said no, unless you taught those courses anchored in texts from a Western canon. And all of these are attempts, I think, to remake the relationship between boards of trustees, state policymakers, legislators, and universities. And they relate particularly to questions of curriculum that traditionally have been left to faculty and institutions of faculty governance, and presage some conflicts, some ongoing conflicts about who should decide what students should be learning and how they should be assessed. Now, this is not to say that any of these issues will appear in the coming legislative cycles. For sure, we're historians, we don't predict the future, but these are all trends that we saw cropping up in various different contexts. And we think it's critical to prepare for the possibility that they may be coming to your state, or they may be picked up by public university systems that relate to where you live. So I'd like to invite my fellow panelists to join me now, Julia Brookins and Jeremy Young. And now that we've looked at some specific language from bills, I think we'd like to have a conversation about what we've noticed, how universities are responding to these new legislative requirements, and what this means for higher ed faculty and people who have an investment in how history education happens in higher education.
Thanks, Brendan. I think that's a great foundation for our conversation, and we will take some questions as well. So if you have one now and you're afraid you're going to forget it, go ahead and put it in the Q&A. We'll get to it in a little bit. So I have been frankly dismayed that this has taken up a larger part of my work time over the last few years. But I feel like I'm hitting my stride here. I'm accepting it, you know, whatever stage that is. And I really think that historians have a lot to contribute in this public policy conversation, things that other academics and other members of the public might not see in the same way, and in terms of the importance and also in terms of our response. One thing I do notice in the recent trends, whether they be about the Western canon or at the K-12 level, there's a lot of talk about Western civilization and classical education as sort of fig leaves for bad history, more so than in their true sort of flowering of what classical education is or could be, and what Western civilization actually is in historical context, right? So I think historians have a lot to contribute there. I really fear for the students because I see these kinds of legislation as really narrowing the aperture on the past in a way that will push a lot of students away from history. And I think that's, for me, that's the real loss, is that students who say, oh, you know, food history, I've never thought of that. Let me look at that and see, well, hey, you know, it connects with my degree program because I'm in hospitality. Food history is something I could really get a lot out of professionally. It will teach me a lot of valuable skills. And also it will give me a better awareness for civic life too, because food history, after all, is history. And so I'll know more about the world I'm living in. And for legislatures to come in and say, no, that won't count. You have to learn a weird sequence of our pet Federalist Papers and then jump to the letter from the Birmingham jail, I think it's very inappropriate and un-American. I worry about intellectual diversity having the legs that it seems to have, because it seems plausible on its surface. And then when you read the definitions, for me, it was like my brain got stuck in a loop reading that Ohio bill, and I just couldn't get out of it. And everywhere I saw it in the text, I said, this is not going to help historians do their work. But I almost see it less as a substitute for something else as it is a substitute for academic freedom, that it's a government version of academic freedom, where it's a socialistic understanding that we need chemists who have different views on tax policy. Why would we care? I don't know that we do. And so those are my initial comments, but I always learn from listening to Jeremy, so I'm eager to hear what he has to say.
Well, thanks, Julia, and thanks for having me on. I want to add a couple of concepts here to what Kat and Brendan have laid out. The first is, as we begin to track, there we go. As we begin to track new legislation that is being discussed in 2025, we don't have a lot of bills yet that we're looking at in terms of legislative text, but there are some hearings going on in places like Texas and Iowa where they're sort of laying out what may be proposed in the coming year. We are starting to see references to restrictions on something they're calling DEI coursework, which is very alarming. Really just an effort to take legislation in places like Texas and Iowa, where it's passed in the last couple of years, to ban DEI offices on the staff side, and then apply those same restrictions to classes and to curricula, and to going through. I mean, what this looks like, as far as we can tell, is potentially, university leaders, lawmakers going through syllabi, going through course descriptions, banning particular courses, removing language from course descriptions, taking things out of general education and requiring that they be taught only as electives or not at all, removing certain types of
disciplines from majors and minors, such as gender studies or LGBTQ plus studies. We don't know what this legislation is going to look like exactly, but these are ideas that are being openly discussed in legislative chambers as we head into the new legislative session. So, I think that is something that we have to keep an eye out on going forward. And the other thing that I would mention, and this really does get to what you can do as a historian on these issues, is a sort of shift in how this is playing out legislatively. In the first couple of years when we all tracked this, 2021, 2022, the weak link for higher education was the legislature, the state legislature in particular. Not a lot of higher education organization going on at the state level, lots of organization at the federal level. So there was a real push to try to pass bad laws, get them on the books, restrict what higher ed institutions could do. We have seen actually a bit of a pullback from that. There's still a lot of bad laws being proposed. And in fact, some of them are more pernicious than what we've seen before, like the DEI coursework stuff. But we've gotten to a point finally now, as we go into our 5th year of this, where it really isn't possible for a lawmaker to propose and push through a legislation that restricts higher ed in this way without having angry people mobbing them in a hearing, or legal teams suing them to overturn the law the minute it's passed. We have seen the only states in 2024 that were able to pass. The only state that was able to pass a DEI ban without any kind of pushback was Iowa, because they slipped it into their budget bill on the very last day of session, so there was no hearing about it. Right? They're trying tactics like that so that they can avoid having to have these direct confrontations with voters, giving opposing lawmakers an opportunity to comment on them. But what we're seeing even more than that now is an epidemic of what we call jawboning. Lawmakers avoiding passing a law at all where they can be challenged in a hearing, where they can be sued on the language, and instead just going to university presidents and saying, you're going to close your DEI office, you're going to cancel these majors and minors or these courses, or we're just going to cut your funding. Or maybe if you don't do it, we will pass a worse law next year if you don't do it voluntarily on your own. Or in the case of Wisconsin, the legislature actually held up the entire appropriation until they agreed to cut DEI offices, meaning that no faculty or staff received a cost of living raise until that went through. And we have been seeing, in the early years, there were a couple of universities that would sort of roll over and sort of over enforce these laws, but they were pretty much waiting for the laws to tell them what to do before they restricted their faculty. Now we're seeing just an avalanche of university leaders over complying, pre-complying, trying to get out of the way of this wrecking ball that is coming their way. It's seemingly gotten worse now with the incoming change in the federal administration, and we're just tracking a lot of institutions that are doing things that they are not required to do under the law, because they're trying to get out of the way of sort of disapproval by lawmakers. And so it really has become increasingly important, in my view, for faculty at universities to hold their leaders' feet to the fire. Because the weak link now is not the legislature. The weak link is the university presidents, who are having to deal with these issues and who are thinking, well, I can tell these lawmakers no, but then I'm going to lose a $50 million appropriation. What do I do? And all the incentives are on one side for them in terms of how they act. The incentives need to be on multiple sides. So I think the role of a faculty senate is very important. The role of faculty members just commenting on these things publicly, talking to their leaders, is very significant. There really is a need to strengthen the backbone of university presidents so that they can push back against this stuff, because that is where the real effects are coming in now.
Thank you. I will, if it's okay, I'm going to ask a couple questions we had first, and then we'll move to some of the questions that attendees have asked. The first one of which you sort of have set up very nicely, Jeremy, with the jawboning comment. So I think for us, one of the questions has been, how do we work against this? And it sort of divides a little bit into where you might find yourself, right? Those people in blue states might think, oh, well, this doesn't really apply to me. I don't need to do anything. And those in red states might think, oh, well, there's I'm outnumbered, there's not much I can do. So the scope of human agency needs, I think, to be a little bit defined among the history community so that we have a common set of activities and tools, regardless of where you are, that you can do and know that it's helpful in advocating for honest history. Brandon, we haven't heard from you in a while, so I'd like to hear
Yeah,
your comment.
sure.
You look like you're about to say.
So I think tying these two together, Jeremy, I mean, you brought up job owning, and I think I didn't dwell on it in the case of the North Carolina Reach Act with the required texts, but this is an instance where the administration at the University of North Carolina, the flagship R1 campus, agreed to implement this new requirement, sort of in exchange for the it not having to be legislated. And if you talk to faculty on the ground there, a lot of them are able to modify their courses and sort of without throwing everything out the window, fall under the fall within the terms of the bill. But I think it's also an issue where the argument that the bill is responding to is one that has very little relationship to what actually happens in history classes. There are certain circles, if you look in certain media, there's this narrative that like historians don't want to teach the Constitution anymore, that we need to be forced to teach these to teach with primary sources and to teach these foundational texts. And of course, that's not true. There are a lot of history faculty in many institutions who are already teaching the Federalist Papers or the Constitution or the Declaration of Independence. But when it comes to actually moving from this sense like, oh, well, we need to teach this history to how do we actually implement it? Faculty themselves are the ones who know how courses work. They know what the experience is like for their students in their classroom, and there's real space for historians and history educators to be the expert on higher education, and in talking to administrators or policymakers. They don't always listen. But if you go to them and say, hey, why are you trying to require 6 texts separated by 170 years in a 1-semester course? This is how I like to teach it. Instead, it changes the narrative, and I think it, some legislators are, and certainly a lot of administrators and policymakers are responsive to that kind of engagement. But if history faculty don't speak out, don't share an understanding of what is actually happening, that point of view is generally not then going to be reflected in the policies or the legislation that results from it.
Thanks. One of the questions we've had is about this job owning question, and I just want to put it in here. I think it'll be helpful. Jeremy, I know you've written on this and you've written well on it. What should university leadership do to stand up and protect universities against attacks on freedom of expression?
So we are not necessarily calling for university presidents to go out and, make a big public statement saying this bill is bad. And I think sometimes that's what people expect of them on a campus, and it's not necessarily the smartest move. What you want them to do is do everything they can to actually stop the bill and to refuse to participate in restrictions that are not legislatively mandated, basically to require that lawmakers pass a bill if they are going to comply with it. And that doesn't always involve a big public statement, but it definitely involves some work behind the scenes. University leaders have limited leverage with lawmakers. Ultimately, they have a certain cultural cachet in their communities, but lawmakers hold the purse strings. They do have some leverage, though, and our argument is that this is probably the most important thing they ought to be using that leverage on. Because ultimately, if you are going to restrict ideas on a college campus, you are creating a university that is not really a university in the sense that it is a place of intellectual freedom where students can learn and faculty can teach free of ideological restrictions by the government. You are instead allowing the heavy hand of government censorship to police ideas on that campus. So we need university leaders to stand up for this in a strategic way. It doesn't necessarily mean they're going to speak out loudly and publicly, but it does mean that they're going to do everything they can to avoid complying with something that is not a law and to push back against a bill that may become a law.
Thanks. So another question that this kind of introduces a little bit is some of the related issues. What do we see as the outlook for accreditation of higher education institutions and in shared governance and tenure? I know Kat addressed that some of the bills we've seen in the past in her presentation, but how do we see the connection between these governance issues? And I might, I know the Faculty Senate has been on a chopping block in at least one state as well. How are these connected, I guess, to the other issues we've been discussing, and how might they affect historians particularly?
So these are levers of power that that people who want to censor and restrict university educators are trying to pull at various levels to bring about those restrictions. And in particular, with when you said earlier about people in blue states may feel like there's nothing they need to do right now, I think the results of the election have completely upended that calculus, because now we are going to have a federal Department of Education that is going to be trying to weaponize every system they have to restrict education, not just in public universities in red states, but in public universities in blue states and in private universities all across the country. So the Department of Education, one of the key tools that they have to do that is their oversight of accreditors. And we have already seen proposals. Project 2025 calls for banning accreditors from requiring DEI standards. And just before I jumped on this webinar, I sent a comment to the Western Association of Schools and Colleges, which is one of the 7 regional accrediting bodies, which has proposed to preemptively comply with this threat by withdrawing all of their DEI language from their existing standards without being forced to by the government, just because it was threatened to do so, as far as we can tell. So, that is something where what's interesting about the Western Association, or WASC as it's known, is that while these are not truly regional accreditor associations anymore, most of the schools WASC accredits have historically been on the Pacific Coast in states that are 100% blue and have no state requirements at all. And yet this is the accreditor that is considering removing its diversity standards. So ultimately, there is no place in this country that is safe from this kind of censorship, that is safe from people over complying or pre-complying with restrictions, and that is going to have an impact on historians, all across the country. So these are the fights that we have to get into. We have to push back against whether or not we support particular goals of diversity, equity, and inclusion offices, push back against this kind of pre-compliance with threats from the government to change the ideology of an institution, to restrict ideas on a campus. That, I think, is going to make a huge difference.
Thanks.
Yeah, and I'd add, I mean, the playbook on accreditation, a lot of the organizations that drafted essentially the bills that we've been talking about here, or promoted model bills from which language has been extracted, are pretty clear about what their playbook. In fact, you can find it online. A couple of these bills were drawn from model legislation from Civics Alliance, which is an outgrowth of the National Association of Scholars. The America First Policy Institute has weighed in and offered some suggestions for what the future of higher education should look like. And as Jeremy suggested, the Department of Education, the nominee to be Secretary of Education, Linda McMahon, is currently the chair of the board of AFPI, and you can see, she may not follow through on some of the agenda that's laid out there, but it's a good place to look to see the sort of things that are being considered, and they are clear. One of the 30 changes they see for higher ed is a free market in accreditation, which would sort of allow all kinds of end routes around the current accreditation system, for better or for worse. But it would be a significant change, and that would affect every institution.
Thank you. Well, we're running low on time, so I'm going to take a couple of the attendee questions. We discussed pre-compliance already. Another question we have here about the required texts. This appears to reduce the likelihood that women and gender would be encompassed in a one-semester U.S. history survey. And is this part of a calculated move in the face of the last 60 years of historical scholarship on women in the United States? This seems notable. And I will just add a little bit here and say, yes, there are a couple things going on here. There's a kind of, I think it's called the snow job, where there's just an overwhelming profusion of detail in what they want covered to not leave a lot of space for other things to be there. And I would also say that many people drafting this model legislation do not have access to a breadth of expertise in the historical record. And so even if this were not intentional in the sense of, well, let's make sure they don't learn women's history, it is intentional in the sense that they are not making sure that they have anybody on staff who knows anything about women's history. So it's both overwhelming the space with something else and not including a well-established historiography like women's history.
Yeah, and the places where we have seen these curriculum requirements, they're usually framed as a civics and or history class. And so Ohio, SB 83 also included the same list of 6 texts that we saw in North Carolina. And in Ohio, there was also recently a push to create new civics centers on campus who have sort of operate outside of academic departments, can hire their own faculty. And in that case, it seems like it's part of a move that creates more spaces for instruction and core requirements, the kind of courses that departments depend on for enrollments to be taught by hand-selected faculty or perhaps sometimes adjunct faculty, sort of operating outside of disciplines and departments.
Yeah. We have another question about, do any of the bills provide a definition of the Western canon or Western civilization? Some of the K-12 model legislation and some of the general education things do make a list of things that they think are part of Western civilization. I won't bore you with it here, but it is not, again, I think there's an issue here where the academics they've turned to provide them with the list are not a broad swath of academics with deep expertise in world history and non-Western history. So it's not, they think they're comparing themselves to something, the woke boogeyman, but in fact, they don't actually know what that is when it comes to history curriculum. So it's not very sophisticated. It might still be quite dangerous to mainstream historians, but it's not very sophisticated in terms of the expertise they're drawing.
And in practice, this kind of language and requirement usually pushes the decision to the universities, who often tend to be more conservative, in the sense, in their interpretation of the laws, than even the legislators seem to have intended. So, you might have an associate dean who's told, well, you get to decide whether these classes have enough content related to the Western canon or not. No offense to associate deans.
Well, I was going to say, this is a great opportunity and something everyone can do if you have an associate dean. One of the things that I think is making this campaign so effective is that a lot of history departments and programs were sort of on their heels before that started. From the bean counters at the colleges and universities who are saying, oh, well, you don't have enough majors, or your enrollments aren't where we want them to be, or this doesn't look like you're training students for high demand career fields, whatever it might be. So I think advocacy within your institution, just to people who are not necessarily out to get you, but who also might not understand the value of what you do day to day, is really an important part that anybody can play in this. and making sure that your career office understands what your students are learning and how it prepares them for careers, making sure that your associate dean understands the courses that you're offering. And, you know, if you have a student success data you can look at and tout, then that's another way of speaking to internal audiences at your institution that can put you in a stronger position ultimately. We have a question about California. We have two questions about California. One person was puzzled to see California on this list, and another person has a question about the new ethnic studies requirements for graduation in California and how they're pushing history and American institution classes out of local and transferable degrees. Do you have any recommendations for advocacy for traditional history courses without acting in conflict with the important work of our colleagues in ethnic studies? And here I'm going to ask Brendan specifically to tell us a story about Michigan.
Oh, sure. And I don't want to, I will try and keep it general because I don't want to out anyone in particular here. But I was in conversations with an organization that is drafting new K-12 curriculum requirements for various different kinds of ethnic history in Michigan, and they had originally framed the legislation as being ethnic studies, like a package of ethnic studies requirements. But in conversation, it sounded really like they just wanted to make sure that different groups were represented in the U.S. history curriculum. And so I asked a similar question, like, you know, are you consciously referring to the discipline of ethnic studies, which has a long and proud and important tradition, because it sounds, you know, your description is at odds with the way in which you're using the terminology. And in that case, I'm pretty sure, I think they actually removed ethnic studies in the end from the descriptions of the bill. But yeah, I mean, it's you know, states have a lot of power to decide what should be in their curriculum. You know, ethnic studies is an important and valid approach. I'm a historian. I think history is an important and valid approach too. Some places seem to offer an alternative between the two. But I think honestly, a lot of like what we're talking about in terms of advocating for history in other contexts applies there as well. If you think that these requirements should be satisfied by more traditional history courses, you know, go talk to legislators, because it may not be that there are that many other advocates out there who are making their opinions known. You know, sometimes these changes are made without much consideration for the knock-on effects that they'll have to other faculty and other departments. Jeremy, though, might be able to address why California is on the PEN America map.
Yeah, we have California on the Pan America map for two separate reasons. One having to do with a 2021 law that is part of the ethnic studies discussion. It's not the stuff that's being currently discussed, but it's a law that was passed in 2021 that, in our view, mandated a version of ethnic studies principles that was overly restrictive on the teachers who were supposed to teach it at the high school level. And the other reason it's on the list is because of a policy, a DEI policy at the California community college system, applies only to the community colleges in the state, which again sort of took one of these smart, interesting guidances about how you can apply anti-racist teaching to your course, and then through a series of letters and documents, the chancellor basically mandated that every word of that document be followed in order for faculty to be retained or promoted. It wrote that it was a baseline and a minimum standard. And you know, these are both of the latter of these has resulted in a lawsuit, which seems to be being viewed favorably in the courts. You know, these are not positions that we feel particularly happy about having taken. We don't think that ethnic studies or DEI is dangerous or is bad, but there is wording in these policies and laws that has sort of singled out and mandated a particular version of these concepts that is unique to California. We don't see this in any other state in the country, so that's why we put them on the list.
Thank you. And we had a question about academic freedom. We're gonna share a link to one of the AHA's congressional briefings where we brought a number of experts in academic freedom to the congressional office building in DC, and they had a great conversation. It's about an hour long. It was recorded, and I urge you to watch that on C-SPAN. The link will be in the chat. So for now, I think we're gonna close and wish us all luck. And I'll hand it back to Jim Grossman.
And this concludes what's next for history in higher education. We hope you found this conversation useful. I want to once again emphasize that you are not only historians, you are not only teachers, you are residents, you are neighbors, you are constituents. And therefore, all the things that we're talking about, you are not powerless. You need to contact your legislator when something happens that you think is important. The other thing is I want to emphasize what Jeremy ended with, which is censorship, whether it comes from the right or from the left. And that the work that we're doing, the work that Penn is doing, emphasizes academic freedom, emphasizes censorship. The point is not whether it comes from the right or from the left. This kind of consistency is absolutely crucial if you're going to have any legitimacy whatsoever as an activist working with state legislators, as someone who wants to try to convince a legislator that what you're interested in is academic freedom and quality history education. If you're not a member of the AHA, we hope you'll consider joining to support programs like this. A link to our membership page is in the chat, and a recording of today's event will be emailed to you when it's available. Questions or feedback can be sent to ahaonline@historians.org. And thank you very much for attending.